Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Bathos of Bezos, Cultural Death in Venice. Bathos, noun. Especially in a literary work, an effect of anticlimax created by an unintentional lapse in mood from the sublime to the trivial or ridiculous. Well, hi everybody, and I'm sure you'll recognise this image. So I'll be talking about the marriage of the Bezoses, if you can put it that way. And straight off the bat, because as you can probably tell, I'm a bit of a fashion icon. It struck me just that they knew that there was going to be loads of photographs, and they knew Mrs. Bezos was going to model what looks to be some fabric version of a toilet roll holder. But surely, even I know, being sartorially challenged as I am, even I know that stripes don't go with other patterns. So why didn't they, for all the money they've spent on making this the supposedly most perfect wedding in human history, why didn't they just have a blank or plain marquee pattern, or lack of a pattern, just a plain monocolor for the background? This was always going to clash. But anyway, it's just a surprise that I was never employed as an event organizer, having noticed this. But here we are, the notion of oceanic feeling I'll explain as we go along. And I ask your indulgence in this talk because I'm going to go off on slight tangents, but I absolutely promise you by the end of the talk, all the strands will be pulled together. So there might be moments when you're thinking, what has this particular item got to do with the rest of it? But please trust me, I will bring it all together and hopefully show you how it all hangs together. But this notion of the oceanic feeling, that's what I'm building up to. But basically, it's an idea of, without sounding too woo-woo, being at one with the universe. And I'm opposing that notion. I'm going to claim that comes, for me at least, because I'm not a particularly woo-woo person. I'm using that technical term woo-woo, but I hope you know what I mean. Tree-hugging, all-encompassing consciousness, Gaia, let's all teach the world to sing, all that feel-good stuff that I struggle with. But oceanic feeling, it relates to that, and I'm opposing it to the egotistical banality. Instead of an ocean, the canals of banality that the Bezoses, it's difficult to say that, the two new members of the Bezos family and their cohorts of celebrities, what they've inflicted on the world. So that's the idea. And just to give you a very quick, I am in this talk going to share with you more than you probably want from the dark interior, the cobwebs of my dark psyche. So please, in the comments, point out if you'd rather in future I really didn't bother. But there's just various elements of today's talk that I can relate to personally. So I thought I'd try this, happy clappy, sharey thing, which, I don't normally do much of at all. So this is, the oceanic feeling also relates to, there's a guy called Sandor Ferenczi who was a colleague of Freud early on, and I think with a lot of his colleagues he fell out with him eventually. But he has this concept of Thalassa, and it's parts of his book about Thalassa are laugh out loud funny, even though they're not supposed to be, because his notion is that we came from, ultimately, from lungfish that came out of the water pools at the earliest time of evolution. And his idea was we're all in various ways trying to get back to the sea. And that can manifest itself also in psychological forms as returning to the womb. So I'll talk about that later in regards to reading and the amniotic calmness it can induce. But it just reminded me of the reverse Thalassa is basically coming out of the amniotic basically being born. You're coming out of the calmness and serenity of the amniotic sac, where all your nutritional needs are met, and you're being thrown out in the birth pangs of pain for your mother into a cold, unforgiving, bright world. And so that's the opposite of Thalassa in some senses. But I had a funny experience because my good friend Richard Grannon was giving me dropped me off at Liverpool Lime Street train station because I'd done a video with him. And this is the type, I don't think this is exactly the car he's got, but it's very similar to this. It's some BMW sports type car. And I'm quite a large bloke. And there was 4 of us in the car at the time. So, or 3 of us, but 2 in the back. No, there's 4 of us. Sorry, yeah, there was 4 of us. And I had to go in the back. And Richard body shamed me because he didn't draw the seat back far enough. And it was difficult enough getting in the car, but on the way out of the car at Lime Street Station in Liverpool, it looked like, if you remember the scene from the film Alien, when the alien comes out of the guy's stomach, that was shouted at me by a guy waiting in a 4x4, because it took me ages to get out of this car, to squeeze out of it, like I say, going back to being born again. And this typical Scouser in a 4x4 shouted, it's like watching the bloody Alien. And it reminded me, if you ever watch, what's it called? It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. There's a segment in that, there's a scene where Danny DeVito is hidden in the back of a couch and comes out of it naked. So luckily I wasn't naked. But I'm traumatized, so I'm talking to you about it because it's a type of catharsis. But anyway, there's reverse Thalasas. I'll be talking about Thalassa as well. But having shared far too much, this is the type of activity that went on in the Bezos wedding in Venice. And in a certain sense, if you think about it, Venice has always been, throughout history, a scene of sybaritic excess and, conspicuous consumption, the doges and political intrigue and all sorts going on. But I just love this particular picture because I believe I'm right in saying this is one of the many fame-hungry Kardashians, more of which later. But the idea of one of these celebrity creatures is being photographed by another one, and behind her is yet another person either filming or taking a photograph. So it's a beautiful example a practical example of the hyper-real, which I just think, yeah, it reminded me of a quote I've used before, and I'll often go back to. I just love it. And if you think it's 1958, The Adventure of a Photographer by the Italian novelist and short story writer Italo Calvino. And I just think it summarizes, and amazingly, in 1958, so it's almost 70 years ago, and yet it's so apposite and prescient. The minute you start saying something, how beautiful, we must photograph it, you're already close to the view of the person who thinks that everything that is not photographed is lost, as if it had never existed, and that therefore, in order really to live, you must photograph as much as you can. And to photograph as much as you can, you must either live in the most photographable way possible, or else consider photographable every moment of your life. The first course leads to stupidity, the second to madness. And I just think that summarized perfectly the whole ethos of the celebrities taking photographs of the Bezos wedding. And now here is this is for people of my generation, the dreaded boomers. And if you were born in the UK at a certain time, he happens to have been a Liverpool comedian. And he was truly demented. But Kenny Everett, and this was his character, Cupid Stunt. And I encourage you to go on YouTube and find some videos, because he basically was always pretending to be interviewed, or he was speaking directly to camera. And his catchphrase was, I'm sorry for my awful impression, but he'd basically say, it's all done in the best possible taste, and rotate his legs in the air, jump up in his seat while staying seated almost, if that makes sense, and switch his legs around. And what I found vaguely amusing about this is that this came to mind when I was thinking of the people in the Bezos wedding. It's all done in the best possible taste. It seemed to be the mantra that they were working under, and yet it had the opposite effect. And also, just as a side note, the idea that Kenny Everett doing this, I'm guessing this was the late 70s or 80s. I don't quite know when this was taken from. But the idea that he would now not be allowed to do this for various reasons. But at the time, this was the absolute height of hilarity. And, there are people who've won Eurovision looking like this, and no one's allowed to find it humorous in the slightest. So it just shows you how over, a couple of generations or more, what the definition of satire, what Kenny Everett was trying to satire actually cannot be satirized anymore upon fear of upsetting people. But anyway, there's Cupid's stunt, and we will be returning to her, him, they, them at the very end of this talk. So this is from a shopping list. This is how exciting this channel gets. But the following items should be in stock at all times, regardless of quantity used. All open packets must be replaced after each visit. Now, just to warn you, it's the actual text without the spelling mistake from the manual for staff at Jeffrey Epstein's house on the island, the Epstein Island, written by Ghislaine Maxwell. And this was it was published, I got this off a website, it was published in the UK. And this was, I'm giving you an excerpt from the actual manual that all the staff had to adhere to. So this is the shopping list. And this is just an excerpt. These are the beverages that you had to, the stock check that they had to do to make sure there were supplies all the way around the house. So you've got Fiji water, talking of which. Then you've got Maxwell House coffee, more of which in a second. And then you've got Starbucks ground Colombian coffee. And these all had to be checked off to make sure that there were adequate supplies. And then, as if that wasn't enough, this was listed as Ms. Maxwell's breakfast preferences. Maxwell House coffee served with milk. And this is the eponymous Maxwell House coffee. And I understand there are many reasons why I have a very odd mind. And I understand the darkness and the horrible things that must have gone on the Epstein Island. So I'm genuinely not trying to downplay those. But one thing that stuck with me, because my mind is weird, when I'd read about this and I realised you're on this fantasy island where all these billionaires are hanging out, and at least some of them, including Mr. Epstein, are drinking either this or pre-ground Starbucks coffee. And that set me off thinking. It relates, and this is why this talk may seem quite diverse and discursive, but actually, one of the unifying themes is the poor taste of incredibly rich people. So I started off talking about the Bezos wedding, and I'm now talking about Epstein and the billionaire's island of depravity that he created. But please, just keep this in mind. This is like a metaphor that I'm asking you to concentrate on for the banality. I mentioned banality in an earlier slide. But rich people's banality of mind, they can have all the money in the world, but their taste, it's not, quoting Kenny Everett again, in the best passable taste. It's not at all. A lot of their mental lives are in the worst possible taste. In this case, literally, in coffee terms, this is one of the worst things if you're a coffee snob. I'm about to indulge my coffee snobbery, impose it upon you. But this is what they're drinking, some of them. And just to reiterate and underline, I'm asking you to think of this image when I also talk later on about the quality of mind that reading allows you to develop. And the underlying point I'd like to make is that you can be a billionaire And if you can't understand or are not able to read certain things, all the money in the world hasn't helped you with what I'm going to develop in future videos, a concept called mental wealth. So rather than mental health, there's a thing called mental wealth. And it strikes me that a lot of these very, very rich people rolling in money either have no taste either in instances like this that are demonstrably provable, but more generally, how many of them understand great literature? How many of them understand any philosophy? And that I'm fascinated by that, because it just, again, sorry to reiterate the point, but it's the underlying banality of what seems to be from the outside, this amazingly extravagant, glamorous lifestyle. So back to the Bezos wedding, when they're on those Venetian ferries, little taxi boats, I kind of can't stop imagining of, rather than how, how envious I should be, the banality of their conversations in the most part. What do they speak about? The great Maxwell House cup of coffee they had in the morning. But anyway, just to develop this in more depth, given that some billionaires at least has been documented in Ghislaine Maxwell's staff manual for Epstein Island, I'm just showing you, this isn't mine. This I've taken off the internet, but I have an extensive coffee collection. I'm not a materialistic person, but in so far as I am, it seems to apply to tea and coffee, which I'll talk about tea in a second. But I've estimated roughly in pound sterling. The grinder in the background is called a niche grinder, and it's good but relatively low level. So none of this is the most expensive you could buy. That grinder's probably about £550. So what's that? $750. The kettle is a really good one, an antler kettle. But the important thing is you could get a stovetop version. It's the long, thin spout that matters, because it allows you to pour accurately the water, more accurately than a normal kettle, over the filter that you can see next to it. And there's a couple of scales. I think the kettle would cost about £150, $200 maybe, and £100 for the scales and filter carafe thing. So all in all, that's about £800, call it $1,000 roughly. And what interests me is that setup, if you bought fresh coffee beans from a good coffee roaster, rather than beans that have been roasted and sat in a supermarket for months on end. So I get them sent to me. I have, believe it or not, in the past roasted my own beans. I've got the equipment for that. That's how sad I am. But if you get sent directly and you know when they've been roasted, the beans are at an optimum from about 2 or 3 days after they've been roasted till about 2.5 weeks is when they're at their absolute best. So if you're following all of that, and you get fresh beans, you've got a decent grinder, this equipment would allow you to have a cup of coffee about as good as it gets. And again, this is probably much better than most billionaires are going to have, because if they have the taste for Starbucks pre-ground coffee, which is already stale, this just gives you an indication of the relative lack of investment you can make, or in our lives. What I'm trying to point out is it's not necessarily about money. I understand, £800 isn't nothing, but with £800, you could have around about the best coffee experience it's possible to have in terms of filter coffee. And this is an example of, it's interesting that Epstein liked Starbucks pre-ground coffee, because in the coffee community, Starbucks is referred to as charbucks because they over roast the beans. And I'm not saying these are actual charbucks beans, but you get the point. This is just an illustration of good, well roasted beans and over burnt, horrendous, cinder like beans. And the flavor profile is completely different. But Starbucks leans towards excessively dark roasts. Just to repeat, I'm not saying they are Starbucks charbucks beans, but that's what they lean towards. And one of the reasons for that is not because they taste better, but if you roasted them like the light ones you can see, if you roast beans properly, you're taking a chance because you want to go as close to what's called the second crack when you hear them cracking. And that's the best quality of that particular type of bean. But that would mean that every batch of beans you did, if you roasted them to bring out the best, they would taste slightly differently, even if that was because they tasted better. So what huge brands like Starbucks do is over roast, which detracts from the flavor profile, but it means you can be much more consistent because they always know exactly how the beans are going to turn out, which gives you consistency, but it downplays taste. And the ultimate example of that, this is the equivalent for a coffee snob like me of a horror film. Apparently, this is a grande iced pumpkin spice latte bought from a Starbucks store in New York City. And always amuses me because latte in Italian just means milk. So people think they've been incredibly sophisticated ordering a latte, and the Italians just laugh because it's like little toddlers. What that is not a coffee lover's drink. That is basically taking the essence of coffee and doing everything you possibly can to make sure you can't taste any coffee. It's beyond me why you would do that. But anyway, this is all, I'm giving you examples of poor taste. I'm trying to give you a metaphorical example of in the coffee world what the Bezos wedding is equivalent to, and how across society that there are lots of things that are done in poor taste that people subscribe to, but they don't. There's no reason why they should. There's no reason why many more people couldn't have a decent home setup for good coffee. But this is presented to them as the acme, the best you can aspire to when drinking coffee, and it's absolutely atrocious. It's in the worst possible taste, and maybe even a better example because I've spoken about coffee. But tea, so it interests me, this tea bag here is Stash Premium Tea. And I just found this photo, which I quite like, because it's got the Van Gogh picture on the mug. So there's a tiny bit of artistic integrity. But the idea that this is premium tea. And again, I'm trying to get you to think of the way in which, in our everyday lives, what good taste isn't catered for, even though it would be quite easy. So if you know anything about tea, coffee might not be of interest to you, but tea, it's such a popular drink worldwide, and yet the vast majority of people consume it like this, purely apparently for convenience. But what I'd ask you to think about is that how much more difficult is it to have a teapot and just rinse out, have a sieve over the sink and rinse out the leaves every time you make a pot? You've got to find somewhere to throw that tea bag. And anyway, tea bags have atrocious quality. So these are the various different types of grades of tea, which I'll explain more. But you see up in the corner, dust. This is what goes into tea bags, fannings or dust. They're two different types. Dust is even worse than fannings. But that's the rubbish that goes in your tea bags. And I'm sure you're tearing your hair out already thinking, what has this got to do with anything? But I'm trying to emphasize the extent to which, in our incredibly affluent societies, we still voluntarily do things unnecessarily in poor taste without even realizing what poor taste it is. And I'm picking on tea and coffee because they're not, I'm using them as metaphors of wider cultural values, but also literally they're about taste. And I want to try and get across to you how the vast majority of people have tea bags and what by definition they are then missing out on in terms of actual physical taste. So these are how the leaves, you've seen previously the grades of how the tea is dried, but these are how the teas are picked. And at the top you see just the single tip, and this means that when the actual tea leaves are picked by pickers in the plantations. It's an absolute art. Even if you use your fingernails, or you're not allowed to use fingernails or secateurs, cutting implements, because it bruises the tea leaf. So there are techniques to use the balls of your fingers, your fingertips, to snap off just the tip. And if you do that, it's incredibly laborious. It's incredibly skilled, because you're trying to fill a huge bag just of those tips. But when it's done, that tea has a completely different quality to the lower forms of tea when you pick much more quickly more of the leaf. But even when all of this is done, what's interesting is it's incredibly relatively cheap. Even if you bought one of the best types of tea that involves just picking the buds, I figured out it must be about, I have a Japanese black tea that I order all the way from Japan, and it must work out in Japanese black tea. It's rare because they don't make a lot of it, so there's very relatively little supply compared to somewhere like India or China, because most Japanese tea tends to be green. In Japan, there isn't an awful lot of land available for agriculture because of the nature of Japan. But even taking all that into account, I worked out, I think it costs about 75 pence or $1 for every small pot of tea. Now, in those terms, I'm having a very rare, very relatively expensive, or by tea standards, a very, very good pot of tea. And it's £1 a pot. Oh, sorry, $1, 75 pence. There are Indian Assam teas that you can get. They're called clonal because they're not grown from tea seeds. They're grown from cloned plants. So it's the best of Assam. And that's about 60 cents. You could make a small pot of tea for 60 cents. So in terms of, it all sounds incredibly snobbish. But actually, if you look at the economics of it, people are drinking much more expensive drinks of massively lower quality. And I'd argue it's because they don't have the knowledge. And this is we're finally getting there. But the point I'm trying to make is the amount of knowledge you can gain, that's all it is. It's knowledge. You don't have to be privileged to have that knowledge. You don't have to be rich to then enjoy the benefits of that knowledge. Good coffee and tea should be available to nearly everyone. But it isn't, because society has these ways of proceeding that encourages not the best possible taste. And what I'm doing here is proving this is true in terms of things like tea and coffee. Imagine how much worse it is for aspects of reading, for the life of the mind. And that's why I wanted to bore you senseless with what might seem to be just the finer peculiarities of tea and coffee. But if you just keep in mind that they are metaphors for the wider processes of society that keep the best possible taste down and don't allow people to access the finer things of the mind. And to take it back to the whole Epstein thing, the fact that some of the richest people in the world, when they wake up in the morning, I just think one of the greatest pleasures in life is a good cup of coffee in the morning. And he's drinking Starbucks pre-ground coffee, stale, awful coffee. And he was mixing with billionaires, because I think it's debatable how rich Epstein actually was himself. And just to repeat, I'm sorry if I'm, flogging this to death, but the parallel I'm making is all these incredibly wealthy people. What's the mental equivalent of this awful coffee or awful tea they're drinking? I doubt very much they're enjoying the best of literature, whether some of them may actually own some amazing art. But I'd be very suspicious as to the extent to which they can actually appreciate. They may collect art because they're rich enough, but the ability, you can only, even they can only own so many paintings, whereas you can go to most galleries for free or for a small amount and see some of the best art in the world. And it's not what you can pay, it's what you bring to the party in terms of knowledge, or the way you've developed your aesthetic appreciation, or the types of books you've read that help you enjoy more books because you build up this reservoir of knowledge and you can make references and links between them. Very, very little of this has anything to do with money or wealth. It's mental wealth. It's not wealth. And just to finish, because I don't want to, of this particular section, just to give you yet more, I'm just showing you that the complexity. So, you know, if you think back to the tea bag, this isn't even. You're a level above what goes into tea bags, and these are the various grades that are possible. So I quite like this idea of FTG, FOP, the second one. Finest tippy golden flowery orange pico. Far too good for ordinary people. And just to repeat yet again, this all sounds technical, this all sounds incredibly elitist, but when you break down how much they cost, it's actually not that much at all. And these are, I've just listed not all of them, but a lot of the categories. And at the very bottom, fannings and dust, these are what go into tea bags. So it's the absolute lowest of the low. And I promise you, this is the last you've got to hear from me about tea. But this is pu'er tea, which is fermented, and you get them in cakes. And I'm embarrassed, I'll admit this. I am embarrassed enough to admit that I have a pick, a specially designed pick for pu'er tea, because it's like a tea chisel where you can break up without doing too much damage to tea cakes. But these are fermented in storage cellars for years to develop complex fermented tastes. And this is how, you know, again, they're expensive, but not ridiculously when you break them down to how much a small pot of tea costs. So I've done coffee, I've done tea, and there's one more. I have no links with this guy whatsoever, but it did interest me because I think this relates to what counts as popular for the algorithm and how tastes are developed on YouTube. This guy is Belgian, or Flemish, I think. So Flemish, Dutch, Belgian would be his own language. So I'm guessing English is his second or third language, and his English is amazing. And he's got the calmest voice. So he starts off his videos with, hello, and welcome to Belgian Beer Brothers. He's got this really nice, mellifluous voice. And his knowledge of Belgian beer, that's what the channel's all about. And he does other types of beer, but mostly Belgian beer. The quality of his analysis of what many people take for granted, beer is beer. Well, I mean, you can see on the screen he's got a mock bottle of Duff beer, the Homer Simpson favourite. But this guy represents for me an amazing level of knowledge about beer, an amazing ability to assess and describe the taste of excellent, excellent world-class beer, which again, per bottle is not that much compared to what people spend on other stuff in their lives. But if you look at his channel, he's got hardly any views per video. And I'm not shaming him. I'm saying it's such a shame given the quality of what he's doing, which set me thinking, because I'm hardly setting the world alight in terms of viewing figures. And this video is probably one of the reasons why, the content thereof. But it does fascinate me that even when I do a video, I often think the ones that have done best, the ones that do least well are the worst, are the ones I think actually, in terms of the quality of the content, were best. There seems to be this inverse relationship. And I've seen many people online doing beer reviews, and this guy is brilliant, and he gets no credit. His numbers are really low. So just as a complete side thing, if you get the chance, please check him out and try and bump up his numbers, But it just seems to me emblematic of what the algorithm promotes over genuine good quality. But then to get back to the Bezos, because that was a very large detour. But as I say, if you've had the patience up until now, I'm going to bring all this together, as I said I would at the beginning. But given that the Bezos wedding took place in Venice, and it gave rise to the subtitle Cultural Death in Venice. Death in Venice is a novella by Thomas Mann, the German writer, and this is just one quotation from it. There were profound reasons for his attachment to the sea. He loved it because as a hard-working artist, he needed rest, needed to escape from the demanding complexity of phenomena and lie hidden on the bosom of the simple and tremendous. Because of a forbidden longing deep within him that ran quite contrary to his life's task, and was for that very reason seductive, a longing for the unarticulated and immeasurable, for eternity, for nothingness. To rest in the arms of perfection is the desire of any man intent upon creating excellence, and is not nothingness a form of perfection? And I won't bore you with the whole plot of Death in Venice, but it's a bit dodgy, to be honest. It's a guy who fancies or is attracted to a boy he sees on the beach. And at the very plot spoiler, at the very end, he never acts on this, but at the very end of the novel, he basically falls asleep and dies in his deck chair whilst looking at this young boy. But there's this concept of the oceanic feeling I mentioned at the very beginning, the concept of the sea. And this introduces the death in Venice by the seaside, looking at the sea. And at the end of the book, he dies in this situation. So he just becomes part of cosmic consciousness again. But it just struck me as the exact opposite of the Bezos mentality of what Venice was turned into. So Thomas Mann takes the concept of a holiday in Venice, explores dark parts of the human psyche. So there's, wildly inappropriate child focus that this old lecherous man has, and turns it into an artistic reflection upon the nature of mortality, this focus upon the sea, the concept of the infinite and the immeasurable for eternity, for nothingness. And the Bezos focus upon Venice is about the opposite of eternity. It's about the instant gratification of the celebrity photograph, the measurable. So it's about the TikTok and Instagram and followers they can get. It's about all the opposite values that Thomas Mann's discussing here, which made me think about, this coincided, the Bezos wedding, with a couple of books I'd been reading about the act of reading. And I started off reading the Mark Hodgkinson one, No One Round Here Reads Tolstoy, because he was born almost to the year I was, not quite, I don't think, but within a couple of years of each other. And he describes, he was brought up in Manchester, which was about 35 miles away from Liverpool, not far at all. So geographically very close. The time, I've got vivid memories of the things he described, so it was really a nostalgic read. But it started to make me really angry because this book encapsulates the type of attitude, you could call it the teabag attitude. He starts off, I think he's got 3,500 books, and he thinks he has a problem. He's got too many books. He's obsessed with collecting books. Well, so am I, but I've never seen it as a problem. And in the end, I think he goes to therapy because he's worried about this mania for collecting books. But he's got this teabag. It's about convenience. He wonders. It's slightly Jekyll and Hyde because the way he describes the act of reading, he mentions some serious people. He mentions some good authors, but then he's quite sniffy. I'll give you examples in a second, some quotes, whereby he's sniffy about elitism. So all the things I was describing about tea and coffee, I think he's the equivalent of defending the tea bag over proper quality tea. And someone like me raging on about why don't people drink proper tea would seem like a madman to him. Yet there are instances in the book where he's disappointed that someone he's watching telly with, I think it's a play, Don't Look Back in Anger, and they made a TV adaptation of the play, and the guy watching it with him has a really Philistine response to it, and he doesn't pick him up on it because he doesn't want to get into an argument, but he's disappointed because he can't talk to him about what a good play it was and the use of language and why it's really, a beautiful thing. But then in other parts of the book, he's sniffy about things he think are too elitist. And I don't think he ever reflects upon it. He's got this chip on his shoulder that he didn't go to very good school and he didn't have a very good education, but he's loved books all his life. But then in the appendices, he mentions piles of books around his house that he's in the process of reading or about to read, and he gives descriptions of them. And many of them are just low-level teabag type books. So what I'm puzzled about by this book is that no one round here reads Tolstoy. Even the title, I can't work out whether it's a good or bad thing that people don't read Tolstoy, because whilst he seems to be advocating the need for more people to read and what a powerful aspect of life it is, he's also ambivalent about to what extent you read the best possible things you can read. And it's that slight banality, the values he has about what constitutes good literature, and how, scratch the surface, he seems to be saying the type of great literature posh people recommend is somehow tainted by the fact they're posh and privileged. And I'm contrasting that with the Francis Spufford book here, The Child That Books Built. This reminds me of The Oceanic Feeling. I think it's a brilliant book cover because you can see the kid who's created a tent for themselves. They're closed off to the world. This little light where the torchlight they're reading by. And the rest of the world is dark or on the outside. And they're completely caught up in their own interiority. And the Francis Spufford book I might look at in future, I hope to, because I think it's a much, much better book about what reading gives you and why it's important. And I think in some ways Spufford addresses the oceanic feeling, this contact with what Thomas Mann was talking about, the immeasurable, the eternal, and all the things that stand in value terms in opposition to Bezos and company. And I just think the Mark Hodgkinson book is such a disappointment because he has the opportunity to make the same type of arguments, but he seems hamstrung by his own chip on the shoulder, if that's not mixing metaphors or body parts. He doesn't seem to be able to enjoy the act of reading as much as he should because he doesn't push himself, because he doesn't feel... There's a class issue all the way through. And I think Spufford was brought up in a much more privileged way. But I probably was somewhere in the middle. I had working class parents, but grew up in a middle class house. And I had access to a good education, but not a public school education in English terms or a private school in American terms. It turned into an independent school, but I passed a public exam and I didn't have to pay anything. It was basically a scholarship. And Hodgkinson didn't. And this seems to have haunted him for the rest of his life. So I'm in the middle. I'm much more on Spufford's side, but he came from a much more middle-class family than I did. And I'm guessing had a much better education than I did. Whereas Hodgkinson has this lifelong disappointment. But rather than, my attitude's always been, why should only the rich or the privileged have access to the best literature available? So back to the tea and coffee. Ironically, they don't have access to the best tea and coffee because they lack the knowledge. And some posh people, yes, have had private education. They've learned ancient Greek and Latin, and they've had opportunities that I never had. But I've always seen that as a challenge. Why wouldn't you want what they've been gifted? But why shouldn't that be available to absolutely everyone? And I'll give you examples of what, because I don't mean to misrepresent him at all. I'll give you examples of what Hodgkinson says that I completely and utterly disagree with. And again, in future, I want to look at Spufford's book because I just think it's quite powerful. So this is an example of one of the things Hodgkinson says. When asked to tender, he's talking about literary critics and privileged people that he opposes himself to. When asked to tender book recommendations, these writers are fulfilling an enticing commission and doing so playfully and provocatively, with a genuine desire to share the delight of reading. Unfortunately, these endorsements can have the opposite effect and narrow the culture, forming a consensus that is the antithesis of the role books should play. Much worse, such lists and assumptions of well-readness foster elitism. Haruki Murakami, author of Norwegian Wood, agrees. If you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer mocked the notion of a literary canon. Now, there's quite a few things I could say here, but I don't think Mark Hodgkinson realises how self-contradictory he is. So he's against the idea that he's against the elitism of this concept of being very well read. But in order to back up his position, he quotes Haruki Murakami, who's in Japan very famous and a lot of people say he's a literary author, but he's also has mass appeal. And Norwegian Wood, I'd argue, is one of his most accessible. There's the Beatles' Norwegian Wood song theme running through it. And it's years since I read it, but it's a romantic, as far as I can remember, it's a romantic undercurrent. It's a short novel, but Murakami's written some incredibly long, difficult, very involved things as well. Arthur Schopenhauer, who's a philosopher that Hodgkinson's quoting, also it's quite niche. If you read Schopenhauer properly, it's not easy at all. So what I'm confused by here is, in order to back up his point, he then makes references to quite niche, elitist writers, which I don't have a problem with, except it's self-contradictory because it runs against his own argument. I'm all for elitism. But if elitism for everyone, if that's not a contradiction in terms, everyone should be given the chance to aspire to the best possible taste. Again, to quote Kenny Everett. And this self-defeating idea that elitism of the mind is somehow wrong. I've spent my life always being puzzled by, in terms of athletics or football, soccer, basketball, the vast majority of the population are immensely comfortable with Darwinian levels of selection and privilege when it comes to the highest levels of sport. No one says, oh, well, even fat people should be allowed to play basketball professionally. No, you're not good enough. Get over it. But any type of elitism in the mind is automatically frowned upon. I just find it really odd that there shouldn't be an equal valuing of the life of the mind. So one of the guys he's criticising is this guy, I think it's Robert McCrum, but he was a literary editor of the Guardian newspaper and quite influential in British publishing for a long time. So McCrum's background and life experience is exceptionally rarefied. Most people do not have the desire, patience, or even the capacity to read, say, The Birds by Aristophanes, one of his recommendations, first performed in 414 BC. So The Birds is a play by Aristophanes, but it made me think, and Hodgkinson latches onto it as evidence of how rarefied is the word he uses and how elitist this Robert McCrum is. And it immediately made me think, there's a play that Aristophanes did called The Clouds, which I'm trying to... I think it was 423 BC, so it was before The Birds. But The Clouds is all about... It's a satire on Socrates and philosophy and the way in which in ancient Greece there would be private tutors charging people to learn rhetoric and how to win arguments just through rhetorical flourishes. And The Clouds, I think it's called The Thinkery. It's an amazing satire that, if you've worked in the modern university sector, is still fresh, because it makes fun of the up its own backside, pretentious, pedantic, what would be the word? Just the narrowness of people's interests, the lack of breadth, all of these things. But it's a brilliant, still relevant, written 423 BC. And Hodgkinson, with reference to The Birds, the same author, is just pouring scorn on the idea this could still be relevant today. For the benefit of the uninitiated, most of us, it opens with a conversation between two middle-aged Ephesians, Persitaerus and Euelpides, as they meet on a hillside. So it begins: he told us that these two birds would show us the way to Tereus, the hoopoe who once was human and turned into a bird. And he sold us that the son of Thalassa, Thalassa there. God, I always like a word or two every video. Thalassa there, the jackdaw for an obol, and this crow for 3 obols, but they turn out to know nothing but nipping. So it's just about, as the name of the play implies, the notion of birds. Thalassa, I think from memory, it's a joke, in the sense, a member of the likely audience. There was a famous guy in Athens, Thalassa, who apparently was short and he had a very loud voice. So the insider joke is that real person is being compared to a jackdaw. The obols are coins, which don't strike me as that difficult. Tereus was a Thracian king, I think. And the hoopoi is this mythical man who's turned into a bird. So I don't think any of this is particularly... Why is that so difficult? But Mark disagrees. The argument runs, and it may have validity, that within these classics of Greece and Rome lie the seed of every story and every character written thereafter. But too often it feels like a currency that only jangles in the pockets of the extremely well-educated. Most of the rest of us are at the window, locked out, wondering what an obol is, who Tereus is, and how exactly a hoopoe turns into a human. I just think he's over-egging it. Why are we on the outside? Why, especially of all the times with the internet, you can look these things up so quickly. But even if you couldn't, the idea that you might actually have to go and look in an encyclopedia and do a little bit of research to help you understand what these things are. I do find it fascinating, this anti-intellectual, anti-elitist attitude. And he goes on to say, who can recall the characters, plots, and scenes even from a book read as recently as just a few years ago? 1 or 2 episodes may jab themselves into the memory bank, but mostly the recollection will be elemental, the feeling you had while reading a book or were left with, having read it. Again, I'm sorry, I couldn't disagree more. Unless I'm uniquely odd, I can remember huge swathes of books because they had such a profound effect on me. And I think the problem Hodgkinson has is he reads pretty rubbish books, to be honest. So he's just decried the fact that anyone would want to read something from 414 BC. But my counter-argument would be Aristophanes is still read because of this Darwinian survival, selection of the fittest. It's powerful, important literature, and it's survived millennia. In the lists of books that Hodgkinson provides in his own book, he reads very current, occasionally some decent, respectable stuff, but far too often he's just reading for the sake of reading, and he's not reading particularly profound or good stuff. And then he's arguing that no books can be remembered in detail. Well, maybe that's because you're just reading bland stuff. To continue wearing the well-read badge will mean rereading all those same books and more on a loop, constantly refreshing the memory. No! Again, it's perfectly possible to remember huge swathes of books just because they're good. And maybe I'm just being really odd. I'd be fascinated to know whether other people have. Is Hodgkinson right? Am I wrong? Or when you read powerful literature, does it stay with you vividly? So the point about rereading books is not because you have to refresh your memory. It's because they're so complex and so good, and you change as a person. So when you go back to them, it's like it's the old thing about stepping in the river. It's never the same river because things have flowed by. You are a different person. And there's many a time I've read books I struggled with years ago. And I came across this phrase, I've really forgotten who said it, so I've just contradicted myself about being able to remember things. But there was a comment made that, what was it about? Sometimes books, it's not that you're not ready for them, they're not ready for you. And I've read books that I struggled with, I didn't like, but I went back to later on in life, and suddenly they made a lot more sense. And it wasn't the book's fault. I just wasn't ready for it. And the reversal, the idea is books choose you almost. I think it's a lovely idea. And again, in this book, no one round here reads Tolstoy. At one point, he says that he reads the first few pages, and if he hasn't been captured, he puts the book down and never goes back to it. Which, again, I think you do have to have some trust. If people keep banging on about a book being worth reading, and if a book survives centuries or millennia, the odds are that there's something there that you need to be a bit more humble about and realise, yeah, you need to make more of an effort and not just take the path of least resistance. So I just find it a truly bizarre book. No one round here reads Tolstoy because it purportedly is a love poem to the act of reading, but it's a weirdly self-hating love poem. But anyway, I'm just going to go on and on. So to be more personal and try and be a bit more uplifting after I've really not liked that book, this is the monstrosity, in architectural terms, brutalist architecture of Edinburgh University main library. And behind it are what are known as the Meadows in Edinburgh. And I'm just showing you because I want to give you a sense at night time. It's relatively isolated. The sun to the left, there's Arthur's Seat, which is like a volcanic plug. There's some hills. It's the views from the top floor are quite stunning. But at night time, which I'll show you pictures of in a second, it gives this feeling of oceanic, of being part of eternity when you're reading, in a weird way. And it runs counter to everything that Hodgkinson was talking about. And the top left, the corner of that building, I'll show you in a second, but that's where I spent most of my PhD, in one tiny corner. And they had these things called canals, which are basically built up self-contained desks that have a back and shelves on them. And when there's a few of them lined up, I'd sit right in the corner. And in those days, the student numbers, went exponentially greater after I studied there. But at the time, very few people ever went up on the top floor. And it would be completely dark apart from the light you had in this carrel. And it really was this oceanic feeling of being alone in the world. And just to take it back to the Bezos thing, it's the opposite of the Bezos thing. It's losing your ego in this oceanic sea of literature, which I don't think Hodgkinson gets at all. But Francis Spufford, in his book, he does. But this concept of the oceanic feeling, so I just want to prove that it's not me going mad. What happened was, there was a writer, French writer called Romain Rolland, which if any of you have ever seen Grange Hill, there's a character called Roland, which is an in-joke about Grange Hill. But anyway, it's a very famous essay, Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. But in 1927, Freud wrote a book called The Future of an Illusion, which was, he was arguing that religion was an illusion. It was false consciousness, basically. And a friend of his was a French novelist called Romain Rolland, and he wrote to Freud and said, in The Future of an Illusion, when you were talking about religion, you didn't really address the concept of the oceanic feeling. This feeling of belonging to the cosmos, which Rolland argued was a precursor or a reason for having religious feelings. I think Rolland argued that religion puts you in touch with a concept of cosmic consciousness. So later on, in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud discusses this idea that Rolland had asked him to. So the oneness with the universe, which constitutes its ideational content, in other words, the oceanic feeling, sounds like a first attempt at a religious consolation, as though it were another way of disclaiming danger which the ego recognizes as threatening it from the external world. So remember that picture on the cover of Francis Spufford's book, was it The Books That Built a Child? The idea that the kid, the ego, is in this protective shell of the tent he's created, completely closed off from the outside world. I think that's one of the aspects reading does. It protects you from the external world because you lose yourself as an ego. It's an interesting defensive mechanism that I think links to this concept of the oceanic feeling. So he goes on to say, the ego detaches itself from the external world. Or to put it more correctly, originally the ego includes everything. Later it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is, therefore, only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed an all-embracing feeling, which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. So this relates to, Freud talks about when we were children, and when you're feeding at it's a concept in psychoanalysis, you're feeding at your mother's breast, you haven't developed a full sense of ego. And we have a vague vestigial memory of adults as being a child in this almost ego-less phase, when the whole world seems to be devoted to you. You're being fed constantly, you're kept warm and comfortable. Excuse me. So it's this sense of self-sufficiency, and you're just you and the world. There isn't much of a separation. But then you get our present ego feeling is therefore only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive. So as adults, our sense of ego isn't the same as this much broader sense we had when we were very, very small children. We weren't fully developed. And that feeling, that all-embracing feeling, which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. And I'm arguing reading, that's what it gives you. It makes your ego feel linked to a much bigger world. And that's what Hodgkinson seems to struggle to get. If we may assume that there are many people in whose mental life this primary ego feeling has persisted to a greater or less degree, it would exist in them side by side with the narrower and more sharply demarcated ego feeling of maturity, like a kind of counterpart to it. In that case, the ideational contents appropriate to it would be precisely those of limitlessness and of a bond with the universe, the same ideas with which my friend elucidated the oceanic feeling. The friend he's referring to is Romain Rolland. So what he's suggesting is that as adults, this vestige, this remnant of what we felt as kids, when we didn't have this sharply delineated ego, that's still with us. And what I'm suggesting, if you take this back to the Bezos idea, that is Venice taken over. And rather than Venice being surrounded by the sea, the oceanic feeling of the great art, the great culture that could be Venice, what you've got is the egos, the sharply delineated, measurable egos of the Bezos, the Kardashians, all those people who inhabited Venice for that wedding. They're the opposite of the oceanic feeling. They want their highly individuated, measurable egos to be up front and foremost. They're the absolute opposite of the notion, the oceanic feeling of being prepared to lose your ego. And I shouldn't laugh, but Sandor Ferenczi, this Thalassa theory of genitality, there are bits that I need help because I found bits of it laugh out loud funny. But this thalassal regressive trend, he takes it even further. So for Ferenczi, the concept of the oceanic feeling is the idea that the essence of life, we all came from, pools, lungfish. We crawled out of stagnant pools by the sea as lungfish, and eventually we evolved into people. So Ferenczi has this idea that all life forms have this weird biological memory of having come from the sea, and that's what we spend our time trying to do. We all want to go back to the sea, like demented lungfish. So the human being is dominated from the moment of birth onwards by a continuous regressive trend toward the re-establishment of the intrauterine situation, and holds fast to this unswervingly by, as it were, magical hallucinatory means, by the aid of positive and negative hallucinations. So again, I see the relevance of reading to this. In Ferenczi's terms, reading allows you access to this ocean of the interuterine situation, in other words, going back into the womb. The full development of the reality sense is attained, according to this conception, only when this regression is renounced once and for all, and a substitute found for it in the world of reality. So, what he's suggesting is most adults, rather than keeping in touch with this oceanic feeling, provide substitutes for it. So again, the Bezos celebrities, they're all trying to find ego substitutes rather than keep in touch with this oceanic feeling. This development is experienced, however, by only a part of the personality. In sleep and in dreams and the sex life and the life of fantasy, the striving towards the fulfillment of that primordial wish is still clung to. So he's suggesting you can find substitutes for this primordial wish, this desire for the oceanic feeling. But in your more subconscious moments, it's still there. In sleep and in dreams, the life of fantasy. Or the people who can't stop having sex, maybe. Which, sorry, this is that same library at night, the Edinburgh University main library. And this is just what reminded me of the concept of the oceanic feeling. Like I said at the very beginning, I am not woo-woo at all, but this is how I'd argue. If you think of this as a massively extrapolated version of that little kid in the bed tent that you see on the front of the Spoofed book, this world created that blocks off the external world. And at night time in particular, I just got this because from memory, it was about 9:45 you got kicked out the library. This must have been in the early 1990s. So I'm sure everything's changed now. But you go off because even in the middle of summer, Edinburgh's a dark city. But at 9:45, you'd get the bells, and you'd get kicked out the library off into the dark night. And it's brutalist. So that is the corner, the one closest to you. That's where I trip down memory lane. That's where I'd be stuck in the corner on the top floor. But this was built in 1967. So weirdly, it's like when I did a talk about the Liverpool Catholic Cathedral. I am not the person who normally would like brutalist architecture. And I did not like this to look at it. But it's just curious that the Catholic Cathedral in Liverpool is brutalist and was built in 1967, the year of my birth, and so was this, 1967. So I've got these ties with it, whether I like the architecture or not. So it's just brutalist. And on a dark, rainy day, it's not pretty. But again, this is just to convey the concept of the oceanic feeling. And at the risk, I really am not trying to compare myself with the subject of a Rembrandt painting. But this reminds me of the sense I had in that library. And again, this is the Spuford, or the Spufford, however you pronounce it, book cover of the kid in the tent with the light. And this is a painting by Alma Tadema. And I was lucky enough, there was an Alma Tadema exhibition in from 1885, I think. And there was an exhibition in Liverpool, the Walker Art Gallery, that I saw. And it's a bit kitschy, it's a bit biscuit tin-like. But what you don't get in a reproduction is he was famous for how he drew or painted marble. So if you were seeing that in real life, the marble glistens. It's incredible. Even though you could argue it's quite a schmaltzy overall composition. But the relevance to this talk is that it's entitled A Reading from Homer. And in Greek early, the epic literature, the Iliad, the Odyssey in particular, it's about, in the background there, the oceanic, the travelling of Odysseus. And that came down through the ages, that story, that Odyssey. Which again is why I take exception to what Hodgkinson says about the great epics and literature of the past. It's part of the oceanic feeling of literature that is everybody's inheritance. And then a complete change of atmosphere is this one, which is, I just love it because you've got the oceanic blue in the back, but the solidity of the actual figure. That's Picasso from 1937. And I just love I always show the Caravaggio painting of Narcissus. But there's almost the same type of circularity in effect. The woman reading in this self-contained, completely solid structure. So it almost looks like a painted sculpture. But I just think this really expresses brilliantly the way in which the act of reading, again, it couldn't be more opposite to the Bathos. Shallowness. So instead of the depths of the ocean of reading, you've got the shallowness of the stinky summer Venice canals of egocentric celebrity, where it's not about the individual finding their own inwardness like this. It's the complete opposite, outward looking, needy. Look at me, look at me. And then I love this because it's so simple, but the way the lines on the floor create this almost, although you can't see it in the background, you get the sense. It's almost like you get the illusion that he's in the corner of a room. Because the apex of the triangle of the lines goes to the back leg of the chair. But I'm assuming, obviously, he's in the middle of a room. There's no reason to think he is in the corner of a room, but I think that's visually the sense you get. And then this is one of my favorites, but again, maybe I need help. I think it's Vesvolod Mikhailovich Garshin, if I haven't butchered that, is the name of the actual subject. It's a very sad story. He was a brilliant Russian short story writer predominantly. And he was much loved by Russian writers, but he died young. He committed suicide, and he had a very troubled mental health situation. I think part of the thing was that he just felt too deeply. So I just think it's a beautiful picture of he's immersed in the books, but there's a haunted look in his eyes. There's a lot of Mikhailovich Garshin. Apologies for any Russian speakers. But there's something about Russian writers, so I'm trying to think of an example of one of his short stories. There was 4 days. Oh, it is so dark. He describes it's a guy going off to war, and he doesn't particularly want to fight. I think it's Russia fighting the Turks. And I'm trying to remember, just paraphrasing a quote, but I think he said something like, the idea that I too would kill people somehow escaped me. I only saw myself as exposing my breasts to the bullets. So he had this really naive idea. He just didn't think it through. He went off to fight because he didn't want to, in the story, he didn't want to leave other people to fight, but he didn't want to harm anyone. And then I think I am dredging up from memory, but I think he's in the middle of he's forced to fight, and he bayonets a Turkish soldier, and he is also injured. So the Turkish soldier lies there dead, and he's lying next to him, badly injured. But it takes 4 days for him to be rescued. And those 4 days are spent watching the Turkish soldier slowly decay. Oh, even by the standards of dark, miserable Russian literature, this is about as dark as it gets. But he's a stunningly good writer. And this was a short story the much more famous Chekhov wrote, which was an homage to this guy. So that's Garshin, and this was the nervous breakdown was Chekhov writing about Garshin. And he talks about, in this short story, the Garshin character, it's a stand-in character that represents him. A couple of friends take him to some brothels. So he's talking about the bordello's interior design, which intentional in its ugliness, not accidental, but elaborated in the course of years. He saw that it all had to be like this, and that if a single one of the women had been dressed like a human being, or even if there had been one decent engraving on the wall, the general tone of the whole street would have suffered. There is vice, he thought, but neither consciousness of sin nor hope of salvation. They are bought and sold, steeped in wine and abominations, while they, like sheep, are stupid, indifferent, and don't understand. It was clear to him, too, that everything that is called human dignity, personal rights, the divine image and semblance, were defiled to their very foundations. So if you keep that in mind, defiled to the very foundations. And then we return to the Bezos wedding, and this was from the pajama party, apparently. Mrs. Kardashian, the modern incarnation, the contemporary incarnation of Cupid's stunt, perhaps. I just like, just to take it back, apologies, but if a single one of the women had been dressed like a human being, they are bought and sold, steeped in wine and abominations, while they, like sheep, are stupid, indifferent, and don't understand. And I think that's why, forgive the banging on and on about the coffee and the tea. It's that I'm just trying to use them as clumsy analogies for this way in which people behave in sheep-like ways, where they could easily obtain more knowledge, they could easily obtain higher levels of taste, and the barriers aren't what you think they are. There's no reason why more people couldn't have a proper cup of tea or coffee, to choose such a simple example. But much more importantly, this thing about human dignity. So these are the very things on Epstein Island. The very person that devoted his depraved life to corrupting human dignity was the same guy, and his partner drinking Maxwell House ground coffee. Everything that is called human dignity, personal rights, the divine image and semblance were defiled to their very foundations. So I'll just leave you after this with one final summary of everything that's wrong with our bovine culture. And I'm pretty confident they drink lousy tea and coffee too. So till the next time, all the very best. Please don't try and defile human dignity like these two. Take care.